In this pod-slice summary of the Huberman Lab Podcast, Dr. Andrew Huberman, a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine, dissects the science of fat loss. He notes that losing body fat, particularly adipose tissue, is a common goal for many, be it for aesthetic reasons, athletic performance, or overall health. However, he acknowledges the confusion and controversy that swirls around this topic. Dr. Huberman emphasizes the vital role of the nervous system in fat loss, positing that it's been largely overlooked in the conversation about weight management. For instance, the nervous system governs the on and off switches for our immune response and fat burning. The number of calories one burns hinges significantly upon factors under our control, such as hormone levels, thermogenesis, body temperature regulation, and connectivity or innervation between the nervous system and fat. Elaborating on the last point, he highlights that neurons connect with body fat and can influence whether that fat is burned or stored. This underpins his assertion that the nervous system is the fulcrum of fat loss, particularly influencing the calories out or calories burned part of the weight management equation. Despite delving into the complexities of fat loss, Dr. Huberman lays some fundamental groundwork. He reaffirms the basic formula that calories ingested must be less than calories expended for weight loss to occur. He also tacitly acknowledges, however, disparities in the a calorie is a calorie argument, pointing to research suggesting processed foods alter how we utilize energy, leading to obesity. Most of his discourse focuses on behavioral tools, changes in habits or routines, to boost fat loss, supplemented by reliable performance-enhancing compounds. His argument underscores the credence that one can significantly control their ability to lose fat and that the nervous system is an essential player in this process. In a nutshell, understanding and manipulating the relationship between neurons or the nervous system and fat is perhaps an under-realized but potent key to effective fat loss. By controlling temperature, hormone levels, and most crucially, establishing neuronal connectivity with body fat, individuals can increase the likelihood of burning rather than storing that fat. Dr. Andrew Huberman continues to delve into the science of fat loss, beginning by emphasizing the importance of getting quality sleep, maintaining correct levels of essential fatty acids, and maintaining a healthy gut microbiome. He discards any notions that dietary supplements are a requirement, asserting that nutrients can be effectively obtained through food. This includes omega-3 fatty acids like EPA, known for its antidepressant effects as well as for promoting healthy metabolism and cardiovascular health. Also highlighted is the significance of glutamine, an amino acid often craved by neurons in the gut. Meeting these cravings can potentially reduce sugar cravings in individuals. Emphasis was also placed on ensuring correct iodine and selenium levels to support thyroid health and, by extension, metabolism. Subsequently, Dr. Huberman refers to a study by Stanford professor Aaliyah Crum that found belief could significantly impact weight loss. In her study, hotel cleaners, when told that their daily activities were sufficient to maintain good health, experienced weight loss, improved cardiovascular health, and other positive enhancements. These results underscored the power of the mind and belief in influencing physical well-being. Accepting that physiology and belief have significant roles, Dr. Huberman asserts that this isn't the end of the weight loss tale. He highlights that several protocols based on scientific literature can be used to enhance fat loss. Sharing a captivating history lesson, Dr. Huberman speaks of dinotrophenol, a toxic and harmful compound painting women in W2 armory factories accidentally ingested, causing them to lose a significant amount of body weight. This deadly compound functions by altering neurons to burn fat differently. Although its use is strongly discouraged, it demonstrates that altering the link between neurons and body fat can powerfully accelerate fat loss. This can be achieved safely and effectively through other means. The focus is largely on thermogenesis, the process of heat production in organisms. Dr. Huberman opines that the thermogenic environment is potentially the most significant factor in fat loss. In the conclusion of this part, Dr. Huberman stresses the need to understand fat utilization. He simplifies it to a two-part process and pushes to identify leverage points, that is, points where we can exert control which benefits us. This sets the stage for further exploration in understanding fat loss better and supplementing it effectively for an improved lifestyle. Dr. Andrew Huberman delves deep into the roles of mobilization and oxidation in the fat loss process. The first step, according to him, is lipolysis, or the mobilization of fat from fat cells into the bloodstream. He places emphasis on breaking the backbone that holds fatty acids and glycerol, the two primary components of stored fat, in order to release these fatty acids into the bloodstream so they can be used as potential fuel. Following mobilization, the second step in the fat loss process is oxidation or utilization. Dr. Huberman notes that mobilizing the fatty acids is only the first half of the battle. In order to actually lose fat, these mobilized fatty acids need to be oxidized or converted into energy. If not, they simply return to body fat. But both mobilization and oxidation are influenced by the nervous system, with neurons releasing chemicals that stimulate fat mobilization and burn up. Among the chemicals that stimulate fat oxidation is the hormone adrenaline or epinephrine. Contrary to previous notions, however, Dr. Huberman indicates that the adrenaline that is key to fat oxidation is not released into the bloodstream, but comes from neurons connecting to fat tissues. Another effective way to stimulate adrenaline release is through subtle movement or fidgeting, activities like moving around a lot, bouncing one's knee, pacing, frequently standing up, and other similar actions. Dr. Huberman notes the work of Rothwell and Stock, who found out that fidgeters burned a significant amount of calories, resulting in fat loss. Some of these fidgeters are innately restless, while others deliberately incorporate fidgeting into their routines. Dr. Huberman concludes that these fidgety activities trigger the release of adrenaline, stimulating fat mobilization and increasing oxidation rates. In essence, subtler forms of movement or fidgeting, such as constantly bouncing one's knee, may potentially act as a catalyst for fat loss. An individual doesn't necessarily need to engage in rigorous exercise to stimulate fat oxidation. Incorporating subtle activities can also contribute significantly to calorie burn and, ultimately, fat loss. In general, Dr. Huberman emphasizes the importance of promoting both fat mobilization and fat oxidation in order to effectively minimize body fat. Dr. Andrew Huberman further explores the concept of non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, or NEAT, reinforcing the importance of subtle movements in fat loss. He then introduces an entirely different approach to losing fat, exposure to cold. Huberman refers to the phenomenon of shivering, which is usually associated with cold temperatures. When you shiver, it triggers a release of a molecule called succinate, leading to the activation of brown fat that increases your body's metabolism and promotes fat burning. The body's brown fat acts like a furnace, and the more of it you have, the more calories you burn. Fat in our body can be categorized into three types: white fat, brown fat, and beige fat. The traditional subcutaneous fat is white fat, which lacks a rich supply of mitochondria. Brown fat, on the other hand, is abundant in mitochondria, and hence can directly convert food into energy. Beige fat is a hybrid of the two, which can be converted into brown fat under certain conditions. This partially explains the widespread, though often misguided, interest in cold exposure as a means of fat loss. Most people, Huberman says, use cold exposure incorrectly, inducing discomfort without triggering the necessary shivering response that leads to the release of succinate. To leverage cold optimally, Huberman suggests a kind of interval training with cold exposure, getting into cold water until you begin to shiver, and then stepping out without drying off for a few minutes before going back in. This cold-warm transition must be carried out a few times within a given period, and this process is what causes maximal release of succinate and activation of brown fat. Emphasizing the importance of consulting a doctor before implementing this protocol, Huberman concludes that it isn't about how cold the water is, but about how your body responds to the cold stimulus. Therefore, the aim should not be to withstand the cold for as long as possible, but rather to encourage the body to naturally trigger the shivering response. In this podcast episode, Dr. Andrew Huberman delves deeper into the science behind fat loss and exercise, with a focus on the effectiveness of cold therapy, interval training, and the intriguing notion of spot reduction. Huberman clarifies the function of succinate, a molecule released when we shiver due to cold exposure. It instigates the activation of brown fat, thereby enhancing metabolism and promoting fat loss. He dismisses the interest around a hormone named irisin, which did not yield the breakthrough fat loss results that researchers had initially hoped. The fascinating part of Huberman's discussion revolves around the types and locations of fat in our bodies. Our bodies primarily host three kinds of fats: white fat, brown fat, and beige fat, with white fat being the conventional subcutaneous fat we are most familiar with. Brown fat profits from an abundant supply of mitochondria and hence can convert food directly into energy. Beige fat, interestingly, is a hybrid that could transform into brown fat under particular conditions like the activation of succinate when we shiver. Huberman suggests an interval training approach to leverage cold exposure optimally for fat loss. Iniditate cold water immersion until shivering begins, step out without drying off for a few minutes, and then get back in to kickstart the process again. This induces a maximal release of succinate, activating the fat-burning brown fat. The host also touches on the notion of fat pads, areas where fat tends to accumulate more in people. Thanks to a better understanding of how neurons control our fat pads, the idea of spot reduction or targeted fat loss is no longer a myth. By engaging in novel, varied exercises, we may encourage the activation of neurons that innervate fat throughout our bodies. This makes the idea of steering the body's fat-burning processes towards these stubborn body fat pads a plausible reality. With regards to exercise, Huberman distinguishes between high-intensity interval training, GI, sprint interval training, SIT, and moderate-intensity continuous training, MICT, offering a deep dive into the science behind their efficacy. He also raises the contentious question about the impact of fasted exercise on fat loss, promising to delve into it further. In the podcast, Huberman explores the effects of food consumption and different intensity levels of exercise on fat burning. He remarks on the confusion surrounding fasted exercise and the ability to burn fat effectively. He explains that insulin plays an essential role in fat oxidation, inhibiting the process when high. Analyzing past research, Huberman explains how eating before exercise can reduce the quantity of fat oxidized during the exercise itself, how eating during or prior to exercise may not impact the amount of fat that is oxidized, and the variation of these results depending on the intensity of the exercise carried out. Huberman shares a significant finding, noting a switchover point at around 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise. If one had eaten within 3 hours prior to the exercise, the amount of fat burned post the 90-minute mark significantly reduces, compared to if one was fasted. He extends this principle to high-intensity training as well, although with high intensity, this switchover comes sooner. With intense training followed by moderate to low intensity, the body begins to utilize body fat stores for fuel, optimizing the fat-burning process. Surprisingly, Huberman notes an inversion in fat oxidation post-exercise, with high-intensity exercises burning more glycogen during the activity and more body fat afterwards. Meanwhile, moderate to low-intensity exercises seem to burn more body fat during the exercise, but more glycogen post-exercise. Concluding this part of the discussion, Huberman advises listeners focusing on fat loss to conduct high-intensity training, followed by moderate to low-intensity training, particularly when fasted. He emphasizes how this could facilitate burning more fat overall, due to elevated post-exercise metabolism rates. He stresses that these strategies should be tailored to individual preferences, ensuring consistency and enjoyment of the exercise regimen. Dr. Andrew Huberman starts this segment by discussing the crucial role adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, plays in fat burning. Depending on the intensity and type of activity, this hormone regulates the rate of fat oxidation and thermogenesis. He elaborates further on nutritional compounds and supplements that can aid this process by enhancing adrenaline production or working along similar pathways. Huberman mentions caffeine as a prominent enhancer as it can increase adrenaline release and increase both alertness and blood flow, but he advises caution due to the potential for adverse effects such as vasoconstriction and cardiovascular risks, especially in caffeine-sensitive individuals. He gives an upper limit of around 400 milligrams and advises individuals to consult their doctors. Another way to stimulate fat burning, Huberman highlights, is through an increase in glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, which enhances the oxidation and release of fat. This can be achieved naturally through the consumption of yerba mate tea, or there are pharmaceuticals available that work along this pathway, though Huberman stresses these should only be used with a prescription. He wraps up the discussion with an examination of how various diets impact insulin and in turn fat oxidation, observed that diets which help to keep insulin levels low tend to foster greater fat oxidation. Each individual should find a dietary regimen that they can adhere to and that caters to their health needs. For Huberman himself, he prefers to maintain low or no carbohydrate consumption during the day to leverage the subsequent adrenaline release and focus, and then consumes carbohydrates at night to facilitate his transition to sleep. The intricacies of fat burning offer various avenues for optimization, as elucidated by Dr. Andrew Huberman. One such tool is the consumption of yerba mate tea, which increases the glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, which in turn enhances fat oxidation and increases metabolic rate. Intriguingly, yerba mate also causes a slight decrease in heart rate. Huberman introduced a related compound, L-carnitine or acetyl L-carnitine, that boosts fat loss by facilitating fat oxidation, converting fatty acids into energy. He highlighted that supplementing with L-carnitine, commonly between 500 milligrams to 2 grams per day with varying aftermaths, has a favorable impact, reducing substances like C-reactive protein and blood glucose. The podcast further explores the attribute of fat loss from the perspective of the nervous system. Dr. Huberman underscores the concept of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT, movements or fidgeting that surprisingly increase caloric burn. He also touches on shivering as an additional form of non-exercise movement that can intensify caloric expenditure and increase thermogenesis. Turning the spotlight on exercise, Huberman dismantles the conventional cardiovascular or weight training categorization and steers the conversation to the impact of exercise intensity. Adrenaline plays a significant factor here, stressing that fasted high-intensity movements transitioning to lower-intensity exercise can be incredibly beneficial. Caffeine helps stimulate this adrenaline release, while compounds from yerba mate tea, triggering the GLP-1 pathway, can increase fat oxidation. Finally, the segment indulges in the importance of having manageable insulin levels, sufficient L-carnitine, and high glucagon levels to facilitate fat oxidation. As a whole, the strategies and findings presented unveil a more dynamic hormones and neuron-centered perspective on fat metabolism. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of The Pod Slice.